The late autumn wind cut across the Sangre de Cristo Mountains like a blade, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of another harsh winter. Thomas McCallister stood on the porch of his ranch house, surveying the land that had cost him everything, his savings, his health, and ultimately his wife's life. The fertile valley stretched before him, watered by springs that Apache bands and Mexican settlers had fought over for generations. At 34, Thomas bore the weathered look of a man who had seen too much loss. His wife, Sarah, had died of fever 2 winters ago, leaving him alone with 1,000 acres of the most coveted grazing land in the territory, and no one to share the burden of working it. The isolation had hardened him, turned him inward until he trusted nothing but his own strength and the reliability of his rifle. Today, however, that isolation was about to end in the most unexpected way. Chief Manolito sat across from him at the rough wooden table, his weathered face grave as he outlined the terms of an agreement that would reshape both their futures. Through the Apache leader's translator, a mixed-blood woman named Aiyana, the proposal was stark and practical. Thomas would receive legal recognition of his land claims and protection from raids, in exchange for marrying the chief's daughter and providing her with a safe home. "Why would your daughter want to marry a white rancher?" Thomas asked, his voice rough from too much silence and too little company. Aiyana translated, then listened to the chief's lengthy response. He says, "She doesn't want to marry you, but she has been damaged by war. She no longer speaks. The young Apache men see her as bad medicine, broken goods. She needs protection, and you need legitimacy for your land claims." Thomas studied the girl who sat silently beside her father. Aiyana appeared to be perhaps 19 or 20, with the classic Apache features, high cheekbones, dark eyes that seemed to see too much, and long black hair that hung loose around her shoulders. She wore traditional dress, but moved with the careful stillness of someone who had learned that drawing attention could mean danger. What struck him most was her absolute silence. She hadn't spoken a word since entering his house, hadn't even looked directly at him. Her hands rested folded in her lap, and she breathed so quietly he could barely tell she was alive. "What happened to her?" he found himself asking. The chief's expression darkened as Aiyana translated his response. "Soldiers attacked her village 3 years ago. They killed her husband and infant son. She was hurt. Since then, she speaks to no one. The medicine men say her voice went to the spirit world with her family." Thomas felt an unexpected pang of recognition. He knew something about loss that stole voices, that made the world seem too dangerous for normal human connection. His own grief had built walls around his heart that no one had been able to breach. "And you think marriage to a stranger will help her?" "He thinks safety and purpose might help her find reasons to live again," Aiyana replied after another exchange. "As for you, this arrangement solves your problems with territorial authorities who question your right to these lands. Legal marriage to an Apache woman with hereditary claims to this valley makes your ownership uncontestable." The practical benefits were undeniable. Thomas had spent 2 years fighting legal challenges to his property rights, spending money he couldn't afford on lawyers and bribes. The territorial government was under pressure to resolve conflicting claims between settlers, Mexican landowners, and Apache bands. A marriage that legitimized his presence while providing sanctuary for a war victim would be politically popular with all parties. But sitting across from this silent, damaged young woman, Thomas felt the weight of taking responsibility for someone so fragile. He was barely managing to keep his own emotional wounds from festering. How could he possibly help someone whose pain ran even deeper than his own? She would live here on the ranch? Yes, she would be your wife-in-law, but... Aiyana paused, choosing her words carefully. The chief hopes that with time and kindness, she might heal enough to become a true partner. If not, at least she would be safe. Through the window, Thomas could see his cattle scattered across the valley, the barn that needed repairs before winter, the endless work that awaited him. Adding a wife to that equation, especially one who might never speak to him, seemed like inviting more complexity into a life he'd been trying to simplify. But as he looked at Aiyana's still profile, something in her absolute stillness reminded him of his own carefully controlled emotional numbness. Perhaps they were both survivors of losses too great for normal healing. Perhaps isolation wasn't the answer for either of them. When would this happen? Tomorrow, if you agree. Apache ceremony first, then territorial magistrate for legal recognition. Thomas made his decision the way he made all decisions now, practically, without allowing himself to feel too much about the consequences. All right, we'll try it. For the first time since entering his house, Aiyana looked directly at him. Her dark eyes held depths of pain he recognized, but also something else, a tiny spark that might have been hope, or might have been the ghost of who she used to be. Neither of them knew that this practical arrangement between two broken people would become something that would transform not just their lives, but the very land they would learn to share. The Apache ceremony took place at dawn in the valley, where several springs converged to form the creek that watered Thomas's land. Chief McCallister had chosen the location deliberately. It was sacred ground to his people, but also the heart of the property that would now legally belong to both his daughter and her new husband. Thomas stood awkwardly in his best clothes, a black suit he'd worn only twice since arriving in New Mexico, once for his first wife's funeral, and once for a territorial hearing about his land rights. The irony wasn't lost on him that this third wearing was for a ceremony that somehow connected to both those previous occasions. Aiyana wore traditional Apache wedding dress, white doeskin decorated with intricate beadwork, silver ornaments that caught the early light, and a necklace of turquoise and coral that spoke of her family status. She moved through the ritual preparations with the same careful silence she'd shown in his house, but Thomas noticed that here, surrounded by familiar customs and sacred symbols, she seemed less fragile and more simply absent, as if her spirit was somewhere else entirely. The ceremony itself was unlike anything Thomas had ever witnessed. Chief McCallister spoke in Apache while sprinkling corn pollen to the four directions, calling upon spirit of earth and sky to bless the union. A medicine woman painted symbols on both their faces with clay mixed with sacred plants. The entire ritual was conducted in hushed tones, with a reverence that made Thomas feel he was witnessing something ancient and powerful. When it came time for the couple to drink from the same gourd filled with blessed water, Thomas found himself looking into Aiyana's eyes for the second time. She held his gaze steadily as they shared the bitter, herb-flavored liquid, and for a moment he felt an unexpected connection, not romantic, but something deeper, a recognition between two people who had both lost too much and were now trying to build something new from the ruins. The legal ceremony that followed in town was perfunctory by comparison. Territorial Magistrate William Hayes performed a quick civil service in his office, with Aiyana serving as witness and translator. The paperwork was signed, fees paid, and suddenly Thomas found himself legally married to a woman whose voice he had never heard. The ride back to the ranch was conducted in the same silence that seemed to surround Aiyana like a protective barrier. She sat beside him on the wagon seat, perfectly still except for the gentle swaying motion of travel, her dark eyes taking the landscape with an attention so intense it seemed almost supernatural. "Those are my cattle," Thomas said as they passed a group of his shorthorn herd grazing near the creek. It was the first time he'd tried to speak directly to her, and he immediately felt foolish. Whether she understood English beyond basic words, whether she was even listening, whether she cared about cattle, all unknown. But Aiyana turned her head to look at the animals, and her expression changed slightly. Instead of the careful blankness she usually wore, her face showed something like interest or perhaps concern. She watched the cattle for several long moments, then looked back at Thomas with an expression he couldn't interpret. When they reached the ranch house, Thomas faced the awkward question of sleeping arrangements. He had prepared the small room off the kitchen that had served as Sarah's sewing room, adding a bed and simple furniture. It would give Aiyana privacy, while keeping them in the same house. "This is your room," he said, carrying her few possessions, a leather bag, a folded blanket, and a wooden box that looked old and precious, into the space he'd prepared. Aiyana stepped into the room and stood motionless for several minutes, seeming to absorb the feel of the space. Then she moved to the single window that looked out toward the mountains, placed her palm flat against the glass, and stood that way for so long Thomas began to worry she was having some kind of episode. "Are you all right?" he asked. She turned from the window and looked at him with an expression that was almost gentle. Then she did something unexpected. She placed her hand over her heart, then extended it toward him in a gesture that seemed to mean gratitude or acknowledgement, or perhaps simply recognition that they were now sharing the space and the strange new arrangement. That night, As Thomas lay in his own bed listening to familiar sounds of the ranch at night, he was aware of new sounds. The soft movement of bare feet on wooden floors, the creak of floorboards in a pattern different from his own restless pacing. Aiyana was awake too, moving quietly through the house as if exploring or perhaps standing guard. When he woke before dawn, as was his habit, he found her already outside, standing motionless beside the corral where he kept his horses. She was perfectly still, face turned toward the lightening sky, and something about her posture suggested she was listening to sounds he couldn't hear or seeing things invisible to him. "Morning," he said quietly, not wanting to startle her. She turned toward him, and for the first time, something that might have been a smile flickered across her face. It lasted only a moment, but it changed her entire appearance, revealing a glimpse of who she might have been before war and loss had stolen her voice. Thomas realized that the silent Apache woman might be the key to understanding not just the land he claimed, but the deeper mysteries of making peace with loss and finding ways to live that honor both the past and the possibility of healing. What he didn't yet know was that Aiyana was about to transform not just his understanding of his ranch, but his entire relationship with the living world around him. 3 weeks into their unusual marriage, Thomas began to notice changes he couldn't explain. His horses, normally skittish and difficult to manage, had become calmer and more responsive. The cattle that had been scattered across distant parts of his range were now clustering closer to the house and creek, grazing in patterns that seemed more organized and efficient. Even his temperamental bull, Satan, who had charged at anyone who approached his pen, now stood placidly when Aiyana walked past. Thomas attributed these changes to coincidence until the morning he found Aiyana in the pasture at dawn, standing motionless among a group of his prize breeding mares. The horses, who normally bolted at human approach, were gathered around her in a loose circle, some with their heads lowered as if in sleep, others gently nuzzling her outstretched hands. "How are you doing that?" he called from the fence line, careful not to approach too quickly and scatter the animals. Aiyana turned toward him, and for a moment her expression showed something like surprise, as if she'd been caught doing something she hadn't realized was unusual. The horses shifted but didn't flee, maintaining their calm proximity to her even as Thomas climbed over the fence and walked slowly toward them. As he approached, one of the mares, a normally nervous chestnut named Stella, extended her nose toward him in a gesture of curiosity rather than fear. Thomas had owned this horse for 2 years, and she had never voluntarily approached him. "What did you do to them?" he asked, genuine bewilderment in his voice. Aiyana looked at the horses, then back at him, and made a gesture he was beginning to recognize, a slight movement of her hands that seemed to encompass everything around them, as if she were trying to indicate something about the connection between all living things in this space. Over the following days, Thomas began to pay closer attention to his wife's daily routines. She woke before dawn and spent the first hour of each day walking the ranch property in a pattern that seemed random but somehow systematic. She touched certain trees, paused at specific spots along the creek, and spent long minutes standing perfectly still in locations that appeared unremarkable to Thomas, but clearly held significance for her. When he asked Aiyana, the translator, to visit and help him understand what Aiyana was doing, the conversation revealed insights that challenged everything Thomas thought he knew about land management. "She says the earth is sick," Aiyana translated after a long exchange with Aiyana. "Too much taking, not enough giving back. The animals know this, and it makes them restless and afraid. Sick how? The soil seems fertile enough. The grass is good." Aiyana listened to Aiyana's response, her expression growing thoughtful. She says, "This is difficult to translate." She says the land has been treated like a thing instead of a living being, like something to be conquered instead of partnered with. She can feel the imbalance. Thomas felt a familiar irritation rise in his chest. "I take good care of this ranch. I rotate the cattle, maintain the water sources, repair the fences." "She's not criticizing your work." Aiyana interrupted gently after more conversation with Aiyana. "She's saying there are other kinds of care that the land needs. Ways of listening to what it requires instead of only taking what you need from it. And she can hear this? The land telling her things?" Aiyana paused, choosing her words carefully. She says her grandmother taught her to feel the connections between all living things. Plants, animals, earth, water, even rocks and wind. When those connections are healthy, everything prospers. When they're damaged, everything suffers, even if you can't see the damage yet. Thomas wanted to dismiss this as Apache mysticism, but the evidence of his animals' changed behavior was impossible to ignore. Moreover, he'd begun to notice subtle changes in the land itself. Plants that had been struggling were showing new growth. A section of pasture that had been inexplicably barren was suddenly green with new grass. The creek seemed to be running clearer and fuller than he remembered. What does she think needs to be done? The conversation that followed was unlike any discussion of ranch management Thomas had ever had. Through Aiyana's translation, Aiyana described a way of working with land that emphasized reciprocity rather than dominance, observation rather than assumption, patience rather than force. She wanted to plant certain native herbs in specific locations. She wanted to alter the pattern of cattle rotation to follow rhythms of weather and season rather than arbitrary human schedules. She wanted to create small areas where wild plants could grow undisturbed, and to modify water flow to create pools where wildlife could drink without competing with livestock. These changes, they would improve the ranch? Thomas asked. She says they would heal the ranch, Aiyana replied. Make it stronger, more productive, more resilient to drought and disease. But it requires working with natural patterns instead of fighting them. That evening, as Thomas sat on his porch watching Aiyana move through the twilight like a ghost, he found himself reconsidering everything he thought he knew about strength and control. He'd spent 2 years trying to impose his will on this land through pure effort and determination. But perhaps true mastery meant learning to listen to forces he'd never bothered to understand. For the first time since Sarah's death, Thomas felt curious about something beyond mere survival. This silent Apache woman might be teaching him not just new ways to manage his ranch, but an entirely different relationship with the living world around him. The first test of Aiyana's methods came in early December, when an unexpected warm spell threatened to confuse the cattle's winter feeding patterns. Thomas had planned to supplement their diet with expensive hay shipped from Colorado, but Aiyana had other ideas. She led him to a section of the ranch he considered marginal grazing, a rocky hillside dotted with scrub brush and plants he'd assumed were worthless weeds. Through gestures and the few English words she'd begun using, Aiyana showed him that many of these weeds were actually nutritious native plants that cattle could graze even in winter. Are you certain about this? Thomas asked as he watched her strip leaves from a thorny bush and offer them to his skeptical bull. These plants don't look like anything cattle should eat. Aiyana's response was to demonstrate. She picked several different plants, crushed them in her palm to release their scents, and offered them to various animals. The cattle, after initial hesitation, began to eat eagerly. Within days, they were seeking out these native plants on their own, and their condition actually improved rather than deteriorated. The success of this experiment led Thomas to give Aiyana more freedom to implement her ideas about ranch management. She began creating what she called medicine patches, small areas where she planted traditional Apache healing herbs alongside plants that would benefit the soil and wildlife. She modified water flow patterns to create a series of small pools and wetlands that attracted birds and small animals. Most dramatically, she changed the way Thomas thought about his relationship with the land itself. Watch! Aiyana translated during one of her visits, as Aiyana knelt beside a section of pasture that had been damaged by overgrazing. She says the earth will tell you what it needs if you know how to listen. Aiyana placed her hands flat on the ground, closed her eyes, and remained perfectly still for several minutes. When she opened her eyes, she began pointing to specific spots and making gestures that Thomas gradually understood meant water here, plant seeds there, rest this area. How could she possibly know all that just by touching the ground? Thomas asked. She says the soil feels different where it's healthy versus where it's tired. Aiyana explained. Temperature, texture, even the way it smells changes depending on what it needs. She learned to read these signs from her grandmother. Thomas was skeptical until Aiyana's soil reading proved accurate. Plants grew exactly where she had predicted they would thrive, and struggled in areas she had indicated were not ready for cultivation. Water pooled in the spots she had chosen, and wildlife began appearing in patterns that followed her recommendations. More mysteriously, the changes seemed to extend beyond the immediate areas where Aiyana worked. The entire ranch began to feel different, more alive, more harmonious, more resilient to the challenges of weather and season. It's like she's conducting an orchestra I never knew existed, Thomas confided to Aiyana during one of her visits. Everything on the ranch is starting to work together in ways I don't understand but can't deny. The most profound change, however, was in Thomas himself. Watching Aiyana work with such deep attention and respect for natural systems was teaching him to see his land differently. Instead of viewing the ranch as something to be controlled and exploited, he began to understand it as a living community that he was privileged to participate in. This shift in perspective came with an unexpected emotional dimension. As Thomas learned to really observe the natural world around him, to notice the subtle changes that Aiyana seemed to perceive effortlessly, he found himself becoming more aware of his own internal landscape as well. The numbness that had protected him since Sarah's death began to crack, replaced by a growing sense of wonder at the complexity and beauty of the living systems he was learning to understand. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely excited about something beyond mere survival. One evening in late December, as they stood together watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of red and gold, Thomas found himself speaking to Aiyana as if she might actually respond. "You're changing everything," he said quietly. "Not just the ranch, but the way I see all of this, the way I see myself as part of it instead of separate from it." Aiyana turned to look at him, and in her dark eyes he saw something new, not just acknowledgement, but kind of gentle approval, as if she had been waiting for him to understand exactly what he had just expressed. That night, for the first time since her arrival, Thomas heard Aiyana's voice. It was soft, barely above a whisper, and spoke only a single word in English. "Good." The sound of that one word, spoken with such quiet satisfaction, told Thomas that his silent wife had been listening all along, and perhaps, just perhaps, she was beginning to believe that healing was possible for both of them. As winter deepened and snow began to accumulate in the higher elevations, Aiyana's influence on the ranch became even more apparent. The cattle remained healthier than in previous winters. The horses were calmer and easier to manage, and even the harsh weather seemed to affect the property less severely than Thomas remembered from past years. But it was during the long winter evenings, when they were confined to the house by weather, that Thomas began to understand the deeper dimensions of what Aiyana was teaching him. She had begun to speak more. Never full conversations, but single words and short phrases that carried surprising weight. "Storm coming," she would say 2 days before clouds appeared on the horizon. "Sick cow," she would murmur, pointing toward an animal that appeared healthy but would develop symptoms within hours. "Good water," when she found a new spring that hadn't been there the previous season. Thomas realized that her knowledge came from observation. So acute it seemed supernatural, but was actually the result of training that had begun in childhood. "My grandmother," Aiyana said one evening, in the longest sentence he'd heard from her, "taught me to see with more than eyes." "What do you mean?" Instead of answering directly, Aiyana took his hand and led him outside into the cold night air. The sky was crystal clear, filled with stars that seemed close enough to touch. She stood perfectly still, then guided him to do the same. "Listen," she whispered. At first, Thomas heard only the normal sounds of night, wind in the trees, distant coyote calls, the movement of animals settling for sleep. But as he stood quietly beside Aiyana, other sounds began to emerge. The creaking of tree branches under snow load, the different tones of wind moving through various types of vegetation, the subtle sounds of water flowing beneath ice. "The land talks," Aiyana said softly. "Different voices for different needs." Over the following weeks, she began teaching him to distinguish these voices. The way wind sounded when it carried moisture versus when it was dry. The different calls of birds that indicated changing weather patterns. The subtle shifts in animal behavior that preceded storms or temperature changes. "Your people learn this too?" Thomas asked one evening as they sat by the fireplace, Aiyana working on a piece of beadwork while he cleaned his rifle. "All people knew this long ago," she replied. "Before towns, before forgetting." Thomas understood that she was talking about something his own ancestors had known, but modern life had trained out of him. The ability to read natural signs, to understand his place as part of a larger living system rather than separate from it. This understanding came with an unexpected emotional dimension. As Thomas learned to pay attention to the subtle communications of the natural world, he found himself becoming more aware of the subtle communications passing between himself and Aiyana. She had begun to express preferences and opinions through small gestures and changes in routine, moving objects to show what she considered better arrangements, spending more time in areas of the house that she found comfortable, preparing foods in ways that revealed her cultural background and personal tastes. Thomas found himself responding to these communications, adjusting his own routines to accommodate her preferences, asking her opinion on ranch decisions through gestures and simple words when direct conversation wasn't possible. The breakthrough came during a fierce blizzard that trapped him inside for 3 days. On the second day, Thomas developed a fever and chills that left him weak and disoriented. Aiyana disappeared into the storm and returned with plant materials that she brewed into a tea with a bitter but oddly comforting taste. As she tended to him, bringing cool cloths for his fever, preparing broths that eased his symptoms, sitting quietly beside his bed during the worst of his illness, Thomas felt barriers beginning to dissolve that he hadn't even realized he'd maintained. "Why are you helping me?" he asked during a moment of clarity. "This marriage, it's just an arrangement. You don't owe me anything." Aiyana was quiet for so long, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she spoke in a voice so soft he had to strain to hear. "You gave me safety. I give you healing. Not arrangement. Partnership." The word hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither had fully acknowledged before. Partnership implied choice, mutual respect, shared goals. It implied that they were creating something together rather than simply enduring parallel existences. When Thomas recovered from his illness, he found that something fundamental had shifted between them. They began working together more consciously, with Aiyana teaching him to read natural signs while he shared his knowledge of livestock management and ranch operations. Most importantly, they began to trust each other. Thomas trusted Aiyana's insight about land and animals, even when it contradicted his previous experience. Aiyana trusted Thomas to respect her methods and to protect the changes she was making to the ranch. By the time spring arrived, they had created something neither had expected, a true partnership based on complementary strengths and shared commitment to the land they were learning to tend together. What Thomas didn't yet know was that this partnership would soon be tested by external forces that threatened everything they had built together. Spring brought more than the usual seasonal changes to the ranch. Along with melting snow and new grass came troubling news that would challenge everything Thomas and Aiyana had built together over the winter months. The first sign of trouble arrived in the form of James Patterson, a territorial land agent who appeared at the ranch house one warm April morning with documents, an attitude that immediately put Thomas on edge. "McCallister," Patterson said, dismounting from his horse with the air of a man conducting official business, "I need to discuss some irregularities in your property claims." Thomas joined Patterson on the porch, noting that the agent's eyes kept drifting toward Aiyana, who was working in the garden she had established near the house. She appeared to be ignoring their conversation, but Thomas had learned to recognize the quality of stillness that meant she was listening intently. "What kind of irregularities?" Patterson consulted his papers with theatrical importance. "There are questions being raised about the validity of your marriage to that Apache woman. Some people suggest it was a sham arrangement designed to circumvent proper land acquisition procedures." Thomas felt anger rise in his chest, but forced his voice to remain calm. "My marriage is properly documented. We have both Apache ceremonial recognition and territorial legal certification." "Legal certification based on the assumption that the marriage was genuine," Patterson replied. "But there are witnesses who claim you and your wife live separate lives, that you barely speak to each other, that this is clearly a political arrangement rather than a real marriage. Who are these witnesses?" "That's not relevant. What's relevant is that if this marriage is determined to be fraudulent, your land claims revert to territorial administration. These are prime grazing lands, McCallister. There are legitimate ranchers who can make better use of them." After Patterson left, Thomas found Aiyana sitting by the creek, her usual expression of calm concentration replaced by something that looked like sadness mixed with resignation. "You heard what he said?" Thomas asked, settling beside her on the bank. "Yes," she replied quietly. "They want the land. We won't let them take it. This ranch is ours, yours and mine together. Aiyana was quiet for several long moments, watching the water flow over stones that she had arranged the previous fall to create small pools for wildlife. My people fought for this land many times, always lost in the end. Different words, same taking. Thomas understood that she was talking about more than their immediate situation. She was referencing a long history of broken promises and legal manipulations that had gradually stripped Apache bands of their traditional territories. "This is different," he said. "We're legally married. We're working this land together. They can't just take it away." But even as he spoke, Thomas realized that Patterson's visit represented a larger threat. If territorial authorities decided to challenge Apache land rights more broadly, no marriage arrangement would be sufficient protection. Over the following weeks, the pressure intensified. Neighbors who had previously been neutral or friendly began treating Thomas with suspicion. Rumors spread to the territory that he was more loyal to Apache interests than American ones. Cattle belonging to other ranchers began appearing on his property. Whether by accident or design, Thomas couldn't tell, but their presence created a potential for conflict. More seriously, young Apache men began appearing at the ranch, seeking Aiyana's counsel about growing tensions between their people and territorial authorities. Thomas learned that the federal government was considering new policies that would restrict Apache movement and force more families onto designated reservations. "They asked me to speak for them," Aiyana told Thomas after one particularly tense visit, "to use my position as your wife to influence territorial decisions." "And what do you tell them?" "I tell them I am one woman, married to one man, caring for one piece of land. I cannot fix the troubles between our peoples." But Thomas could see that the burden of these expectations was weighing on her. The peace and healing they had built together over the winter was being threatened by forces neither of them could control. The crisis came to a head when Sheriff Morgan arrived with a warrant to search the ranch for evidence of Apache resistance activities. The search revealed nothing incriminating, but the message was clear. Thomas and Aiyana were being watched, their loyalty questioned, their partnership viewed as potentially dangerous. That evening, as they sat together watching the sunset over mountains that had witnessed countless similar struggles between different peoples, Thomas made a decision that would define the rest of their lives together. "We need to make a choice," he said. "We can try to convince everyone that our marriage is real and hope they leave us alone. Or we can stop pretending this is just a legal arrangement and admit that it's become something more." Aiyana turned to look at him, her dark eyes reflecting the last light of day. "What has it become?" Thomas took her hand, something he'd never done before, and felt the calluses earned through months of working their land together. "It's become the most real thing in my life," he said. "You've changed everything. The ranch, my understanding of this place, my understanding of myself. I don't want to lose that, even if it costs you everything else. Everything else doesn't matter if I lose this." Aiyana's fingers tightened around his, and for the first time since he'd known her, she smiled with genuine warmth. "Then we stop pretending," she said, "and we fight for what we built together." That night marked the end of their practical arrangement and the beginning of something that would challenge not just territorial politics, but their own understanding of what was possible between two people from such different worlds. The confrontation Thomas and Aiyana had been dreading came in late May, when a delegation of territorial officials arrived at the ranch with the clear intention of ending their marriage and reclaiming the land. Led by Territorial Judge Harrison, the group included Sheriff Morgan, Land Agent Patterson, and 2 representatives from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Thomas met them at the ranch gate, Aiyana standing beside him in a show of unity they both knew would be scrutinized for signs of genuineness. "McCallister," Judge Harrison began without preamble, "we're here to investigate allegations that your marriage is fraudulent and that you're using it to illegally occupy lands designated for redistribution." "My marriage is legal and genuine," Thomas replied firmly, "and this land was obtained through proper territorial procedures." "Proper procedures based on claims that are now in question," Patterson interjected. "We have witnesses who will testify that you and this woman live as strangers, that your marriage has never been consummated, and that the entire arrangement was designed to circumvent legitimate land acquisition laws." Aiyana stepped forward, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and steady despite the gravity of the situation. "I am Thomas McCallister's wife. she said. "We work this land together. We make decisions together. We care for each other and for everything that lives here." It was the longest speech Thomas had ever heard from her, and the strength in her voice surprised even him. But Judge Harrison was unmoved. "Mrs. McCallister, if that's truly your name, we need to examine the nature of your relationship more closely. These are serious legal matters that affect territorial policy and the rights of other settlers." What followed was an interrogation that felt designed to humiliate rather than illuminate. They were questioned separately about intimate details of their daily lives, their sleeping arrangements, their knowledge of each other's backgrounds and preferences. The officials seemed determined to find inconsistencies that would prove their marriage was a sham. But as the questioning continued, something unexpected happened. Thomas and Aiyana's answers revealed not deception, but the depth of partnership they had built over the past 8 months. They knew each other's habits, preferences, fears, and dreams with an intimacy that surprised even themselves. Thomas could describe exactly how Aiyana arranged her healing herbs and why she chose specific locations for different plants. Aiyana could explain Thomas's methods for managing cattle and his plans for improving water distribution across the ranch. They both spoke with detailed knowledge about shared work, shared meals, shared quiet evenings, and shared concerns about the land they tended together. "You say you sleep in separate rooms," Judge Harrison pressed. "How is this consistent with a genuine marriage?" "We sleep in separate rooms because that's what my wife prefers," Thomas replied. "Marriage doesn't mean abandoning all personal privacy. It means respecting each other's needs while building a life together." "And you," Harrison turned to Aiyana, "why would a woman choose to maintain such distance from her husband?" Aiyana's response came after a long pause, and her words carried weight that seemed to settle over the entire gathering. "I was broken when I came here," she said quietly. "War took my family, my voice, my trust in anyone. Thomas gave me safety, time to heal, space to find my strength again. Now I choose to be his wife not because I must, but because I want to. That is not distance. That is gift." The simple honesty of her statement seemed to shift something in the atmosphere. Even Judge Harrison appeared momentarily uncertain, as if he hadn't expected to encounter genuine emotion in what he'd assumed was a political charade. Sheriff Morgan cleared his throat. "Even if the marriage is genuine, there are still questions about Mr. McCallister's loyalty to American interests. We have reports of Apache warriors visiting this ranch, of secret meetings, of possible coordination with hostile elements. Apache people visit here because my wife is a respected member of their community," Thomas continued. "They come seeking her counsel about healing herbs, about caring for sick animals, about finding peaceful solutions to conflicts with settlers. If that's considered suspicious activity, then you're criminalizing the very kind of bridge building that prevents violence." "And what about you, McCallister?" Judge Harrison pressed. "Where do your loyalties lie when Apache interests conflict with American territorial policy?" Thomas looked at Aiyana, then back at the assembled officials. "My loyalty is to this land and everything that lives on it, to building something that works for everyone instead of just some people, to proving that different peoples can live together without destroying each other." "That's not an answer to my question." "It's the only answer that matters," Thomas replied firmly. "I'm an American citizen married to an Apache woman, working land that we tend together using methods that honor both our traditions. If that's not American enough for you, then maybe your definition of American is too narrow." The investigation continued for 2 more hours, with officials examining every aspect of their property management, their financial arrangements, their relationships with neighbors both Apache and Anglo. But gradually, it became clear that they were finding evidence of genuine partnership rather than political fraud. The breakthrough came when Judge Harrison asked to see documentation of their land improvements. Aiyana produced detailed drawings and notes she had made throughout the winter, maps showing water flow patterns, soil health assessments, seasonal grazing rotations, and habitat modifications that had increased the ranch's productivity and sustainability. "You made all these observations yourself?" Harrison asked, studying the sophisticated diagrams. "We made them together," Aiyana replied. "I see what the land needs. Thomas builds what it needs. Partnership." Patterson examined the documents with obvious skepticism. "These look like military reconnaissance maps." How do we know they're not being used to plan attacks on settlers? Thomas felt his patience finally snap. Those are ranch management plans designed to increase grass production and improve water access for livestock. If you think caring for the land is military reconnaissance, then you understand nothing about either ranching or warfare. The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of 3 Apache riders, including Chief Manolito. The officials immediately tensed, hands moving toward weapons, but the Apache leader raised his hand in a gesture of peace. "I come to speak for my daughter," Chief Manolito said in careful English, "to tell you what kind of marriage she has made," through a translator who had accompanied him. The chief delivered a speech that surprised everyone present. He described visiting the ranch throughout the winter and spring, observing Thomas and Aiyana working together, eating together, making decisions together. He spoke of seeing his daughter regain her voice, her confidence, and her connection to the world around her. The territorial official's decision arrived 3 days later in the form of a formal document delivered by Sheriff Morgan, whose demeanor had shifted from hostility to something approaching respect. Judge Harrison had ruled that the marriage between Thomas McCallister and Aiyana was legally valid and that their land ownership was legitimate under territorial law. But the victory came with conditions that would reshape their lives in unexpected ways. "The court recognizes your marriage and your land rights," Sheriff Morgan explained as he handed Thomas the official papers. "But Judge Harrison is also establishing your ranch as an experimental site for what he's calling cultural integration practices. You'll be required to document your methods and share your results with territorial authorities." Thomas looked up from the documents. "What exactly does that mean?" "It means you become a test case. If your approach to ranching and cross-cultural cooperation proves successful, it could influence territorial policy for other mixed marriages and land disputes. If it fails, we'll be blamed for proving that such arrangements don't work," Aiyana finished quietly. "That's about the size of it," Morgan confirmed. "Judge Harrison is betting that you two can demonstrate that different peoples can work together productively. There are a lot of folks who hope he's wrong." After Morgan departed, Thomas and Aiyana spent the afternoon walking their land, seeing it with new eyes now that they knew their stewardship of it had become a matter of public record and political importance. "Are you prepared for this?" Thomas asked as they stood beside the series of small pools and wetlands that Aiyana had created to support wildlife. "Having everything we do watched and judged by people who don't understand what we're trying to accomplish? My grandmother used to say that when the spirits give you a gift, they also give you the responsibility to use it wisely," Aiyana replied. "Perhaps this is a responsibility that comes with what we've learned together." Over the following months, their ranch became an unlikely destination for visitors. Territorial officials, other ranchers, Apache leaders, and even a newspaper reporter from Santa Fe who wrote an article about their unprecedented experiment in frontier cooperation. Thomas found himself awkwardly explaining their methods to skeptical ranchers, while Aiyana demonstrated her land management techniques to Apache leaders who were curious about working with territorial authorities. The attention was often uncomfortable, but it also brought unexpected benefits. Other Apache families began settling nearby, creating a small community that bridged tribal and territorial boundaries. Ranchers who had initially been hostile began asking for advice about soil management and animal husbandry. Mexican families who had been caught between Anglo and Apache conflicts found refuge in the cultural neutrality that Thomas and Aiyana's ranch represented. Most importantly, their own relationship continued to deepen and evolve. The crisis of the territorial investigation had forced them to articulate their commitment to each other and to their shared work. What had begun as a practical arrangement and grown into partnership was now becoming something that neither of them had experienced before, a love based not on romance or passion, but on shared purpose and mutual transformation. "You saved my life," Aiyana told Thomas one evening as they worked together to repair a section of fence damaged by spring floods. "Not just by marrying me, but by learning to see the world the way I see it. By letting me teach you things your people have forgotten." "You saved mine too," Thomas replied. "I was so focused on controlling everything that I'd forgotten how to be part of anything. You taught me that strength comes from connection, not domination." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a rider carrying urgent news. Apache bands throughout the territory were being pressured to relocate to a single large reservation, and some young warriors were talking about violent resistance. As the most visible example of peaceful cooperation between Apache and Anglo communities, Thomas and Aiyana were being asked to use their influence to prevent a war. Chief Menelito wants to meet with you, the messenger explained. He says the spirits have told him that the future of our people may depend on what you and your husband have learned about living in peace. That night, as they prepared for what would become the most important negotiation of their lives, Thomas reflected on how completely his understanding of everything had changed. A year ago, he had been a lonely rancher focused only on survival and success. Now he was part of community, married to a woman who had taught him to hear voices in the wind and see connections between all living things. Are you ready for this? Aiyana asked as they prepared to meet with leaders from both communities. I'm ready to try, Thomas replied. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. As they rode toward the meeting that would determine whether their experiment in peaceful cooperation could be expanded to prevent a territorial war, Thomas understood that their arranged marriage had become something far more significant than either of them had imagined, a demonstration that love, respect, and shared commitment to land could bridge even the deepest cultural divisions. The test of their partnership was about to become a test of whether two very different peoples could find a way to share the same territory without destroying each other or the land that sustained them all.